She spent 11 years believing that she was worthless because her husband told her so. No access to money, no car in her name, no voice in her own home. Then one morning, her 9-year-old daughter handed her a notebook filled with dates, times, and secrets, a child's detective journal, evidence of every lie her father ever told. What happened next? A housewife remembered she used to be a forensic accountant, and she burned her husband's empire to the ground. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about a woman who finally remembered who she was. Stay until the end. Like and subscribe if you believe karma always wins. At 5:17 in the morning, the suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut were wrapped in October fog. A black Mercedes rolled silently into the driveway of a colonial mansion on Maple Ridge Lane. Garrett Caldwell stepped out, adjusting his wrinkled collar. The scent of expensive perfume clung to his shirt. Not his wife's perfume, something sweeter, younger, more intoxicating. He loosened his tie and checked his phone one last time before entering. A text from Sloan glowed on the screen. "Next time, let's make it a whole weekend. I already miss you." Garrett smirked, then slipped the phone into his pocket. He unlocked the front door as quietly as possible, expecting darkness and silence. Instead, a dim light from the kitchen washed across the hardwood floor. His stomach tightened. Someone had been awake. He slipped off his shoes and padded toward the kitchen. The house felt different tonight. Heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. On the kitchen table sat a glass of chocolate milk, half empty. Beside it lay a white envelope with crooked handwriting on the front. One word. "Daddy." Garrett froze. His 9-year-old daughter Madison had written this. He could tell by the purple crayon and the careful, uneven letters she was still mastering. He picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and opened it slowly. Inside was a sheet of notebook paper, torn at the edges. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. "Dear Daddy, I know you weren't at work tonight. I heard Mommy crying again when she thought I was sleeping. I looked up the word affair on the computer because I heard her say it on the phone. I know what it means now. If you don't love us anymore, that's okay. But lying is worse than leaving. Your daughter, Maddie, P.S. I won't need you to walk me down the aisle someday. I'll walk myself." Garrett's hands shook violently. The paper crinkled in his grip as rage and panic flooded through him simultaneously. This wasn't guilt he felt. It was fury. Who taught her to write this? Who put these ideas in her head? He crumpled the letter and shoved it into his pocket. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. A soft sound behind him made him spin around. Vivian stood in the kitchen doorway. His wife of 11 years wore an oversized cardigan over her pajamas, her auburn hair messy from a sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. But those eyes weren't angry. They weren't even sad anymore. They were empty. That emptiness terrified Garrett more than any accusation ever could. "So you read it," Vivian said quietly. Garrett swallowed hard and, "Vivian, I can explain." She held up her hand. "Don't, not tonight. I've heard every excuse you have. This is ridiculous. Madison is 9 years old. She doesn't understand anything about adult relationships." "She understands enough," Vivian replied. "She understands that her father comes home smelling like another woman. She understands that her mother cries herself to sleep. Children see everything. Garrett, they just stay quiet about it." Garrett's face reddened. "You've been poisoning her against me." Vivian laughed bitterly. "I haven't said a single word to her about your affairs. Not one. She figured it out herself because she has eyes and ears and a heart that breaks every time you choose someone else over this family." "Affairs." Garrett stepped closer, his voice dropping dangerously. "Plural. You're being paranoid again. This is exactly what happened after Madison was born. You spiraled then, and you're spiraling now." Vivian didn't flinch. "Gaslighting stopped working on me 3 years ago. Garrett, I just didn't have the courage to say it out loud." Before Garrett could respond, a small voice came from behind them both. "Mommy?" They both turned toward the staircase. Madison stood at the top of the stairs in her butterfly pajamas, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. Her eyes were red from crying, but her jaw was set with a determination no child should have to carry. "Sweetie, go back to bed," Vivian said gently. Madison didn't move. She looked directly at her father. "Did you read my letter, Daddy?" Garrett's throat tightened. "Madison, you shouldn't have written that. You don't understand what's happening between Mommy and Daddy. I understand enough, Madison whispered, echoing her mother's words exactly. The silence stretched unbearably. Finally, Garrett turned away from both of them and stormed toward his home office. He needed to think. He needed to plan. He needed to regain control of this situation before it destroyed everything he had built. The office door slammed shut. Vivian stood frozen in the kitchen, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked up at her daughter, still standing on the stairs like a small sentinel. "Mommy?" Madison said softly. "Are we going to be okay?" Vivian forced herself to nod. "We're going to be fine, sweetheart. I promise." But as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. Madison slowly descended the stairs and walked to her mother. She wrapped her small arms around Vivian's waist and held on tight. "I saved copies of the bad things," Madison whispered into her mother's cardigan. "Like you taught me when we played detective. Dates and times. I wrote them all down." Vivian's breath caught. She looked down at her daughter's serious face. "Show me tomorrow," Vivian whispered back. "When he's at work." Madison nodded solemnly. In his office, Garrett poured himself a whiskey with shaking hands. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Sloan. "We have a problem. My wife knows something. We need to talk." The reply came instantly. "Then we speed things up. Come to my place tomorrow night. We'll figure it out together." Garrett drained his glass. He had spent 15 years building his career, his reputation, his perfect family image. He wasn't about to let a 9-year-old's letter tear it all down. He would fix this. He always fixed everything. But what Garrett didn't know was that the evidence against him had already started multiplying, and the two people he underestimated most, his wife and his daughter, were about to become his greatest adversaries. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Garrett left for work at 7:30 without eating breakfast or saying goodbye. His Mercedes disappeared down the driveway, and Vivian finally exhaled. She had been holding her breath since 5 in the morning. Madison sat at the kitchen table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. Neither of them had slept more than 2 hours. "Is Daddy coming back tonight?" Madison asked. "I don't know, sweetheart." Madison nodded slowly, accepting this uncertainty with a maturity that broke Vivian's heart. After dropping Madison at school, Vivian returned to an empty house that felt more like a prison than a home. She wandered through the rooms, seeing them differently now. The designer furniture Garrett had chosen, the artwork he had approved, the paint colors he had selected. Even the family photos on the walls showed his preferred poses, his preferred backgrounds, his preferred version of their life. When had she stopped having opinions? When had she stopped existing as a separate person? She knew the answer. 8 years ago, when Madison was born, before Garrett. Vivian had been someone. She had graduated top of her class from Yale with a degree in forensic accounting. She had worked for one of the most prestigious financial investigation firms in Manhattan. She had been sharp, confident, ambitious. Then she met Garrett Caldwell at a charity gala. He was charming, handsome, successful. He pursued her relentlessly, showering her with attention and promises. Within 18 months, they were married. Within 2 years, she was pregnant. "You don't need to work anymore," Garrett had said after Madison was born. "I make more than enough for both of us. Stay home, raise our daughter. I'll take care of everything." Take care of everything became control. Everything. First, he consolidated their bank accounts into his name for efficiency. Then he canceled her credit cards because they were redundant. Her car was sold because they didn't need 2 vehicles when she stayed home. Her phone was added to his plan so he could manage the family bills more easily. Piece by piece, he had dismantled her independence while calling it love. Vivian sat at the kitchen table where Madison's letter had been discovered. She pulled out her laptop and tried to log into their bank accounts. Access denied. Password changed. She tried their investment portal. Access denied. She tried the family credit card statements. Locked. Her hands trembled. She had no idea how much money they had. She had no idea where it was. She had signed joint tax returns for 11 years without ever seeing the full picture. She was completely financially blind. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Viv, it's Rachel, using my work phone. I need to tell you something. Can you meet me for coffee? Don't reply from your regular phone." Rachel Tate, her college roommate from Yale. They had drifted apart after Vivian got married, but Rachel had reached out occasionally over the years. Vivian always meant to respond, but somehow never did. Rachel was a divorce attorney now, one of the best in Connecticut. Vivian stared at the message for a long moment. Then she grabbed her purse and car keys. She needed answers. And maybe, just maybe, Rachel could help her find them. They met at a small coffee shop in Stamford, far enough from Greenwich that Vivian wouldn't run into anyone who knew Garrett. Rachel looked exactly as Vivian remembered. Sharp eyes, confident posture, expensive blazer that meant business. But there was warmth in her expression when she saw Vivian approach. "You look exhausted," Rachel said bluntly. "I am exhausted." Vivian sat down heavily. "How did you know to contact me?" Rachel hesitated. "I was at the Pierre Hotel last Tuesday for a client meeting. I saw Garrett in the lobby." Vivian's stomach dropped. "Let me guess. He wasn't alone? A woman? Blonde? Younger? They were very comfortable with each other?" Vivian closed her eyes. Hearing it confirmed out loud made it more real than all the suspicions she had carried for years. "I'm so sorry, Viv. I debated whether to tell you, but you deserve to know." "I already knew," Vivian admitted. "I just didn't want to believe it." Rachel reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm a divorce attorney. If you ever want to explore your options, I'm here. But more importantly, I'm your friend. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." Ooh, Vivian felt tears threatening to spill. "He controls everything, Rachel. The money, the accounts, even my phone. I don't know how to fight someone who holds all the cards." Rachel squeezed her hand. "You were the best forensic accountant I ever knew. If anyone can find hidden money, it's you. You just forgot who you were." Those words echoed in Vivian's mind the entire drive home. She pulled into the garage just as the afternoon sun began to fade. The school bus dropped Madison off 10 minutes later. Madison ran inside and handed Vivian a worn composition notebook. "Here, my detective journal. Like you asked." Vivian opened it slowly. Inside, in Madison's careful handwriting, were dates and observations spanning nearly 2 years. October 15th, Daddy said he was at a conference, but I heard him on the phone saying beach. November 3, Mommy found a receipt for flowers. She didn't get flowers. December 20, Daddy smelled like the perfume from the mall. The pretty bottle shaped like a flower. Page after page of evidence, collected by a child who loved her mother enough to pay attention. Vivian hugged her daughter tight. "You're so brave, sweetheart." Madison looked up at her seriously. "Are you going to fight, Mommy?" Vivian thought about the forensic accountant she used to be, the woman who could trace hidden money through a maze of shell companies, the professional who had helped bring down corrupt executives. That woman wasn't dead, just sleeping. "Yes," Vivian said firmly. "I'm going to fight." Vivian waited until Garrett left for work the next morning before making her move. She had spent the night memorizing every detail of Madison's journal, cross-referencing dates with her own fragmented memories. The patterns were clear: hotel visits every Tuesday and Thursday, jewelry purchases that never appeared at home, weekend conferences that didn't exist on any calendar she could find. Garrett was careless because he believed she was obedient. That was his first mistake. His home office was normally locked, but Madison had discovered the spare key months ago while playing hide-and-seek. She had told her mother about it in a whisper, as if sensing it would matter someday. Vivian's hands trembled as she unlocked the door. The office smelled like Garrett's cologne and leather furniture. A mahogany desk dominated the space, covered with papers he never let her see. She photographed everything: credit card statements revealing weekly charges at the Pierre Hotel, receipts from Tiffany and Company for jewelry she had never received, a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "SS, can't wait for Aspen. Counting the hours. Love. G. Sloan," the woman Rachel had seen at the hotel. Now she had a name. Vivian moved to his computer. The password had been changed, but she knew Garrett's patterns. His ego demanded passwords that celebrated himself. She tried his birthday combined with his college fraternity letters. Access granted. The emails confirmed everything. Months of correspondence with someone named Sloan Prescott, who worked as vice president of client relations at Sterling and Howe, the same investment firm where Garrett served as chief financial officer. Their messages were explicit, not just romantically, but financially. The Cayman transfer went through. One email read, "Meridian Holdings is untraceable now. We're set." Vivian's blood ran cold. This wasn't just an affair. Garrett was stealing from his own company and hiding the money offshore. She photographed everything, uploaded copies to a secure cloud account Rachel had helped her create, then carefully returned the office to its original state. By the time Garrett came home that evening, Vivian had dinner on the table and a pleasant expression on her face. "How was work?" she asked sweetly. "Long. Boring." He barely looked at her. Mitchell wouldn't stop talking about golf at the client dinner. Client dinner. She knew he had been at the Pierre with Sloane. She had found the reservation confirmation in his email. "That sounds exhausting," she said, her voice steady despite the rage burning inside her. Garrett grunted and disappeared to his office with a glass of bourbon. Later that night, Vivian called Rachel from the bathroom with the shower running to mask her voice. "I found everything," Vivian whispered. "The affair, the offshore accounts. He's embezzling from his company." Rachel exhaled sharply. "This changes things. We're not just talking divorce anymore. We're talking federal crimes." "What do I do? Document everything. Don't confront him yet. The more evidence you gather, the stronger your position." "And Vivian." Rachel paused. "Be careful. Men like Garrett become dangerous when cornered." Vivian ended the call and stared at her reflection in the foggy mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't the beaten-down housewife Garrett expected. She was the forensic accountant who had buried criminals before. The next 2 weeks became a careful chess game. Vivian gathered evidence while pretending nothing had changed. She photographed documents, recorded dates, traced financial transactions through public records she accessed at the library. Madison helped when she could, reporting anything unusual she noticed about her father's behavior. "He has 2 phones now," Madison whispered one evening. "I saw the second one in his jacket pocket." Vivian kissed her daughter's forehead. "Good detective work, sweetheart." Finally, Mom. Vivian felt ready. She had photographs of Garrett entering the Pierre with Sloane. She had records of hidden accounts. She had a paper trail that would destroy him in court and possibly send him to prison. She waited for the right moment to confront him. It came on a Friday evening when Madison was sleeping at a friend's house. Garrett sat in the living room, nursing his third bourbon, scrolling through his phone with a smirk that made Vivian's skin crawl. She walked in and placed a single photograph on the coffee table in front of him. Garrett and Sloane, kissing in the Pierre lobby. His face went white. For the first time in their marriage, Vivian saw real fear in his eyes. "I want a divorce," she said calmly. "I want the house, full custody of Madison, and half of everything, including what you've hidden in the Caymans." Garrett's mouth opened and closed. "Where did you get this? I'm a forensic accountant. Garrett, or did you forget I've spent 11 years pretending to be invisible while you treated me like furniture? But I was watching, and I was learning." He stood abruptly, bourbon sloshing. "You have no idea what you're starting." "Actually, I know exactly what I'm starting." She turned toward the door. "My lawyer will be in contact Monday morning." She walked out of the living room feeling stronger than she had in years. She had finally taken control. She had finally fought back. What she didn't see was Garrett's hand reaching for his phone. What she didn't hear was his whispered call to Sloane. "She knows everything. We need to move faster. Activate the backup plan." Vivian thought she had won the first battle. She had no idea the war was just beginning, and her husband was about to burn down everything she loved. The weekend passed in tense silence. Garrett stayed in his office with the door locked, making phone calls Vivian couldn't overhear. She didn't care. Let him panic. Let him scramble. She had the evidence. Monday morning, Rachel filed divorce papers and sent formal discovery requests to Garrett's attorney. The process had officially begun. "He'll try to hide assets," Rachel warned during their meeting. "But you've already found most of them. We have the advantage." But Vivian allowed herself to feel hope. For the first time in over a decade, she was steering her own ship. Madison noticed the change immediately. "You're smiling more. Mommy, I'm fighting for us, sweetheart, just like I promised." 2 weeks later, Vivian received an unexpected call from a lawyer she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Caldwell, my name is Richard Sullivan. I represent the compliance department at Sterling and Howe. We've received some concerning information about your husband's financial activities. Would you be willing to meet with our internal investigators?" Vivian's heart raced. The company was already looking into Garrett. This was better than she could have hoped. She met with their investigators the following day and shared everything she had found. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the transfers that didn't match any legitimate business purpose. The lead investigator, a stern woman named Margaret Foster, took detailed notes. Mrs. Caldwell, you may have just saved this company millions of dollars. We'll need to verify your evidence. But if accurate, your husband is facing serious criminal exposure. Vivian left the meeting feeling vindicated. Everything was falling into place. That evening, she picked up Madison from school with a genuine smile. How about pizza tonight to celebrate? Celebrate what? Our new beginning. They ordered from Madison's favorite place and ate on the living room floor, something Garrett never allowed because it was undignified. Madison laughed for the first time in weeks. The doorbell rang at 7:30. Vivian opened it expecting a neighbor. Instead, she found two police officers and a woman in a business suit holding a clipboard. Mrs. Vivian Caldwell, the woman asked. Yes. What's happening? I'm Sandra Mitchell from Child Protective Services. We've received a report of child endangerment. We need to speak with you about Madison. Vivian's blood turned to ice. Child endangerment? That's absurd. Madison is perfectly safe. One of the officers stepped forward. Ma'am, we also have a warrant to search your home. Your husband reported concerns about your mental stability and potential harm to your daughter. My husband, he's the one who's been cheating and stealing money. I have evidence. The CPS worker's expression didn't change. We'll need to conduct an evaluation. Is Madison home? Vivian's world tilted. She looked past the officials and saw Garrett's Mercedes parked across the street. He was sitting inside, watching. Their eyes met through the windshield. He smiled. Everything she had built was crumbling. Garrett had struck first, and he had aimed directly at her weakest point, her daughter. The next 3 hours were a nightmare. CPS interviewed Madison in her bedroom while police searched the house. Vivian was forced to sit in the kitchen, unable to comfort her child, unable to explain, unable to do anything but watch helplessly. Mommy didn't hurt me. Madison kept telling the CPS worker, Daddy's the bad one. Daddy lies. But the process had its own momentum. At 10:15, Sandra Mitchell delivered the verdict. Given the conflicting reports and the pending divorce, we're recommending a 72-hour evaluation period. Madison will stay at a supervised facility while we complete our assessment. No, Vivian lunged forward. You can't take her. She's safe with me. Officers restrained her gently but firmly. Madison was escorted out of the house, crying and reaching for her mother. Mommy, I want to stay with you. Vivian collapsed on the kitchen floor after they left. The silence was deafening. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I warned you not to start something you couldn't finish. You want war. Now you have one. G. She read the message through blurry tears, rage and despair battling inside her chest. 3 days later, the situation grew worse. Garrett filed an emergency custody motion claiming Vivian was unstable, vindictive, and had manipulated evidence to frame him. His attorney presented records showing Vivian had been treated for postpartum anxiety 8 years ago, twisting it into proof of ongoing mental illness. The judge granted temporary custody to Garrett pending further review. Vivian lost her home, her daughter, and her momentum in a single devastating week. She sat in Rachel's office, hollow and shaking. He took everything, just like that. Rachel handed her a tissue. He won the first battle, not the war. We'll get Madison back. How he controls the narrative now. He has money, lawyers, connections. I have nothing. Rachel's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, then handed it to Vivian. An unknown caller. Vivian answered hesitantly. A woman's voice came through, low and urgent. Mrs. Caldwell, you don't know me, but I know what Garrett is doing to you because he's doing it to me too. My name is Sloane Prescott, and I think we should talk. Vivian met Sloane at a coffee shop in White Plains, far from Greenwich and Manhattan. She chose a table in the back corner where they couldn't be seen from the street. Sloane arrived looking nothing like Vivian expected. No glamorous mistress in designer clothes. Instead, she saw a tired woman with dark circles under her eyes and hands that trembled around her coffee cup. I know you hate me, Sloane said before Vivian could speak. You have every right to. You destroyed my family. I destroyed my own life first. Sloane's voice cracked. He promised me everything. Vivian, a future, marriage, partnership. He said you two were already separated emotionally, just waiting for the right time to make it official. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. There's a difference. Sloan looked away. But I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here because he's doing to me exactly what he did to you. And I need your help as much as you need mine. Vivian leaned forward. Explain. Sloan pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. When you confronted him, he panicked. He called me that night ranting about covering tracks and protection protocols. I recorded everything. Vivian pressed play. Garrett's voice filled the space between them. She found the Cayman accounts. We need to burn the trail immediately. Transfer everything to the Gibraltar backup and shred any documentation that connects me to Meridian Holdings. If the company investigates, we pin everything on Sloan. She's the one who processed the transfers. Vivian looked up sharply. He's planning to blame you. He already has. Sloan's eyes were wet. Yesterday, Sterling and Howe's compliance department called me in for questioning. They have documents with my signature on transfer authorizations I never saw. He forged them. He's been setting me up as his scapegoat from the beginning. Vivian felt something shift inside her. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. She knew what it felt like to be manipulated by Garrett Caldwell. Why should I trust you? Because I have evidence you need, and you have evidence I need. Together we can destroy him. Apart, he destroys us both. Vivian studied Sloan's face for a long moment. What do you have? Sloan opened her phone and scrolled through files. Recordings of him discussing the offshore accounts, emails proving he initiated the illegal transfers, photos of documents he thought he shredded, but I retrieved from his office. Why did you keep all this? Sloan smiled grimly. Because I grew up with a father who cheated on my mother and walked away without consequences. I swore I'd never let a man destroy me without insurance. Garrett just never knew I was collecting. Vivian exhaled slowly. This changed everything. They spent 2 hours comparing evidence. Sloan's recordings filled gaps in Vivian's documentation. Together, they had enough to prove Garrett had committed fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. More importantly, they had enough to prove he filed false reports against Vivian. We need to move carefully, Vivian said. He's already convinced people I'm unstable. If we come forward together, he'll claim we're both vindictive women trying to frame him. Sloan nodded. Then we don't go to his lawyers or the company. We go to the FBI. Vivian's breath caught. Federal authorities? Interstate wire fraud, offshore money laundering, tax evasion. These are federal crimes. The FBI won't care about local custody disputes or divorce drama. They care about following the money. It was risky, but it was also the only path that bypassed Garrett's local connections and influence. I'm in, Vivian said. They shook hands across the table. Two women who should have been enemies, united by a common goal, destroying the man who had tried to destroy them both. The next morning, Vivian contacted Rachel with the new evidence. Rachel's reaction was immediate. This is incredible. But Vivian, you need to understand something. Once you involve the FBI, you can't control the outcome. Garrett could face prison time. Good, Rachel paused. And Madison will grow up knowing her father is a convicted felon. Vivian closed her eyes. She had thought about this all night. The weight of the decision pressed against her chest like a physical force. She already knows her father is a liar. At least this way. She'll know the truth wins sometimes. She'll know her mother fought back and didn't stay silent. Rachel nodded slowly. Then let's make the call. 3 days later, Vivian and Sloan met with FBI Special Agent Thomas Reynolds at a field office in Hartford. They presented everything. The recordings, the documents, the financial trails. Agent Reynolds listened without expression. When they finished, he asked only one question. Are you both willing to testify in federal court? Yes, they said simultaneously. The investigation was officially opened, but Garrett didn't know it yet. For 2 weeks, Vivian held her breath while federal agents worked quietly in the background. She couldn't see Madison except for supervised visits twice a week. She couldn't return to her home. She stayed in a small apartment Rachel helped her rent, waiting for justice to arrive. Then the phone call came that shattered everything again. Rachel's voice was strained. Vivian, we have a problem. Garrett's mother just filed a motion claiming you fabricated evidence. She's putting up $5 million for his legal defense. and she's hired the most aggressive family law firm in the state, Judith Caldwell. Garrett's wealthy widow mother who had always looked at Vivian like an inconvenient accessory. Can she do that? She's doing it. And there's more. Sloan didn't show up for her scheduled FBI interview this morning. Her apartment is empty. She's gone. Vivian's blood ran cold. What do you mean gone? Cleaned out. No forwarding address. She left a note saying she couldn't risk her career and freedom for a fight that wasn't hers anymore. The floor dropped out from under Vivian. Without Sloan's testimony, the recordings were hearsay. Without Sloan's corroboration, Vivian was just a bitter ex-wife with questionable evidence. Garrett had gotten to her, paid her off, or threatened her into disappearing. Everything was falling apart again. And this time, Vivian didn't know if she could climb back up. Vivian sat in her small apartment, staring at walls that felt like a prison cell. She had lost her home, her daughter, and now her only ally. Garrett was winning on every front. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, but something made her answer. Mrs. Caldwell. A woman's voice, hesitant but determined. My name is Helen Brennan. I live in the apartment next to Sloan Prescott's old place in Manhattan. Vivian sat up straighter. How did you get my number? Sloan left it with her building superintendent before she disappeared. She said if anything happened to her, I should contact you directly. Why? Helen's voice dropped lower. Because I heard everything through those thin apartment walls. Every conversation she had with your husband. And I recorded most of them on my phone because, frankly, that man scared me and I wanted evidence in case something went wrong in my building. Vivian's heart pounded. You have recordings. I have 8 months of recordings, including the night your husband told Sloan exactly how he planned to destroy you in court and make sure you never saw your daughter again. Vivian pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from crying out. Why are you telling me this now? Because I watched the news yesterday. There were running stories about your custody battle, painting you as an unstable woman who fabricated evidence against her innocent husband. I know that's not true. I heard the real Garrett Caldwell through my walls. Will you testify? Silence stretched for several seconds. Then Helen said, I'm 73 years old. I've got nothing to lose and no tolerance for men who hurt women and children. Yes, I'll testify. Vivian finally allowed herself to cry. Real tears, hot and cleansing. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. I have some idea, Helen replied. I was married to a man like Garrett for 28 years before I found the courage to leave. No one believed me either. But someone should have. They arranged to meet the following day. Rachel accompanied Vivian to Helen's small Manhattan apartment, where the older woman played recording after recording of Garrett's voice through the wall. The Cayman transfer went through. Meridian Holdings is untraceable now. If Vivian causes problems, we bury her. I know people at CPS who owe me favors. Sloan, stop worrying. My mother will fund whatever legal fight we need. That woman hasn't spoken to me in months, but she'd rather die than see the Caldwell name dragged through the mud. And then the most damaging recording of all. I don't care about custody. I care about winning. Once I have Madison, Vivian has no leverage. She'll accept whatever settlement I offer because she'll be terrified of losing visitation entirely. Rachel's face was pale when the recording ended. He admitted to using Madison as a weapon. This is exactly what we need. Helen handed over a flash drive containing all the recordings. Take them. Do whatever you need to do. Vivian hugged the older woman tightly. Why did you save all of this? Because I learned the hard way that men like this get away with everything unless someone keeps receipts. I kept receipts. Back in Rachel's office, they strategized their next move. The FBI investigation is still open, Rachel said. Agent Reynolds confirmed they've traced the offshore accounts and frozen several assets. But they need a witness willing to testify about Garrett's intent. Helen will testify. Good, but we also need to address the custody situation. Garrett's mother is pouring money into his defense. The family court judge is getting pressure from multiple directions. Vivian felt exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. What do? We go on offense. File a motion demanding Madison testify about what she witnessed. Children her age can provide statements through a court advocate. Madison kept that journal for a reason. Let her voice be heard. Vivian hesitated. I don't want to traumatize her further. She's already traumatized by living with Garrett. Giving her a voice might be the most empowering thing we can do. After a long moment, Vivian nodded. Do it. The motion was filed the following Monday. Garrett's attorneys fought viciously against allowing Madison to testify, but the judge ruled in Vivian's favor. Madison's interview was conducted by a child psychologist with the court advocate present. Vivian wasn't allowed in the room, but she waited outside, pacing and praying. 2 hours later, the advocate emerged with a carefully neutral expression, but something in her eyes gave Vivian hope. Your daughter is remarkable, the advocate said quietly. She told us everything, the lies, the secret phone, the way her father talked about you when he thought she wasn't listening. Did it help? It helped enormously. The psychologist's report will be submitted to the judge by Friday. Vivian finally allowed herself to breathe. That Friday, she received the call she had been praying for. The judge reviewed Madison's testimony and the new evidence. Rachel said, her voice bright with triumph. Temporary custody has been transferred back to you. Garrett's visitation is suspended pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Vivian dropped to her knees in her small apartment and sobbed with relief. Madison came home that evening. They held each other for a full 5 minutes without speaking. I told them the truth. Mommy, Madison whispered, just like you taught me. You're so brave, sweetheart. So incredibly brave. For one beautiful weekend, they were together again. Safe, protected, victorious. But Vivian should have known better than to celebrate too soon, because Monday morning brought 3 disasters that would nearly destroy everything she had rebuilt. Monday began with sunshine streaming through the windows of Vivian's apartment. Madison was making breakfast, humming a song from her favorite cartoon. For one perfect morning, life felt almost normal. Then the phone calls started. The first came at 9:15. Rachel's voice was tight. We have a problem. Garrett's mother held a press conference this morning. A press conference. She's claiming you manipulated Madison into lying. She's presented affidavits from family friends saying you've been unstable for years. She's announcing a $5 million reward for anyone with information proving you fabricated evidence. Vivian's stomach lurched. Judith Caldwell had enough money and influence to wage war on multiple fronts simultaneously. What do we do? For now, nothing. Let her play her hand. The FBI investigation is still active. Truth will win. The second call came at 11, this one from Agent Reynolds. Mrs. Caldwell, we have a complication. Garrett's attorneys filed a motion claiming our investigation was triggered by illegally obtained evidence. They're arguing the recordings from Helen Brennan were made without consent and should be inadmissible. Is that true? New York is a one-party consent state for recordings you're part of, but Helen recorded conversations she overheard through walls. That's a gray area. The judge will decide by end of week. If the recordings were thrown out, the FBI case would weaken significantly. The third call came at 1:30 from Madison's school principal. Mrs. Caldwell, I'm calling to inform you that Garrett Caldwell arrived this morning attempting to pick up Madison. He claimed he had updated custody paperwork. We refused to release her, but he became aggressive. The police were called. Vivian's blood ran cold. Is Madison safe? She's safe, but she's very upset. I think you should come pick her up early today. Vivian drove to the school with shaking hands. Madison ran into her arms the moment she arrived. He was yelling at the secretary. Madison whispered. He said I belonged to him, like I was a thing. Vivian held her daughter tight. You belong to yourself, sweetheart. Nobody owns you. 3 disasters in a single morning. Judith's media campaign, the legal challenge to the recordings, and Garrett's attempt to physically take Madison. He was escalating. Desperate men did desperate things. That evening, Rachel arrived at the apartment with a grim expression. We need to accelerate our timeline. Garrett's behavior today proves he's becoming dangerous. The judge needs to see this. How? We file for a protective order tomorrow morning. Document today's incident. Request that his visitation suspension become permanent pending trial. Vivian nodded. What about the FBI case? That's separate, even if the recordings get thrown out. The financial evidence stands on its own. Agent Reynolds confirmed they've traced over $3 million in fraudulent transfers. So we're still in this. Rachel managed a small smile. We're very much still in this. But I won't lie. The next few weeks will be brutal. Garrett and his mother will throw everything they have at you. Vivian looked at Madison, who had fallen asleep on the couch clutching her stuffed rabbit. Then I'll throw everything I have back. The protective order hearing happened 4 days later. Garrett's attorney argued that the school incident was a misunderstanding, that a father simply wanted to see his daughter, that the police involvement was an overreaction. But the principal testified. The school secretary testified. Madison's teacher testified about behavioral changes she had noticed since the divorce filing. The judge granted the protective order. Garrett was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Madison's school, Vivian's apartment, or any location where Madison might reasonably be expected to be present. Outside the courthouse, Garrett confronted Vivian while their attorneys watched helplessly. "You think this is over?" His voice was low and venomous. "My mother has more money than you and more lawyers than you can count. I will bury you." Vivian met his gaze without flinching. Something had changed inside her over these brutal months. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. "You've already tried to bury me. Garrett, I'm still standing." She turned and walked away, leaving him sputtering on the courthouse steps. The FBI ruling came 3 days later. The judge allowed the recordings as evidence, ruling that Helen Brennan had reasonable expectation that conversations audible through shared walls were not private communications. Agent Reynolds called Vivian personally. "We're moving forward with indictments. Grand jury convenes next week." For the first time since this nightmare began, Vivian felt genuine hope. The indictments were unsealed on a Tuesday morning. Garrett Morgan Caldwell was charged with 17 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of money laundering, and 5 counts of filing false statements. Federal marshals arrested him at his office in front of his colleagues. The photographs were everywhere within hours. Garrett in handcuffs, being led out of Sterling and Howe while security guards held back the press. Vivian watched the coverage from her apartment with Madison beside her. "Is Daddy going to jail?" Madison asked quietly. "He's going to have a fair trial. Whatever happens after that is up to the judge and jury." Madison was silent for a long moment. "I don't want to visit him in jail." "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, sweetheart." That night, Vivian allowed herself 1 glass of wine after Madison went to sleep. She stood by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. She had won. Against all odds, she had won. But something nagged at her, a feeling that the storm wasn't quite over yet. The morning after Garrett's arrest, Vivian expected to feel relief. Instead, she woke with a knot of anxiety in her stomach that wouldn't dissolve. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The first catastrophe arrived at 8:30. A process server knocked on her apartment door, handing her a thick envelope with a return address she didn't recognize. Inside it was a wrongful death lawsuit from Sloane Prescott's family. The document alleged that Vivian's pursuit of evidence had led to Sloane fleeing the country, where she died in a car accident 3 days ago in Portugal. The family claimed Vivian's harassment drove Sloane to her death. Vivian called Rachel immediately, hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the phone. "This is absurd," Rachel said after reviewing the filing. "Sloane disappeared voluntarily. You didn't harass her. This is clearly funded by Judith Caldwell to create another front in the war. But Sloane is dead." "Yes, and that's tragic, but it's not your fault." Vivian hung up feeling hollow. Whatever Sloane had done, whatever choices she had made, she didn't deserve to die running from consequences that Garrett created. The second catastrophe came at noon. Madison's school called again. "Mrs. Caldwell, Madison had a severe anxiety attack during lunch. She's in the nurse's office. She keeps saying her grandmother told her something that scared her." Vivian drove to the school at dangerous speeds. She found Madison curled on the nurse's cot, pale and trembling. "What happened? Sweetheart, what did your grandmother say?" Madison looked up with tearful eyes. "Grandma Judith came to the school. She found me during recess. She said you're going to lose everything, and I'm going to live with her in California where you can never find me." Cold fury washed through Vivian. Judith had violated the protective order. She had approached Madison directly to terrify her. "That's not going to happen," Vivian said firmly. "Grandma Judith broke the law by talking to you. She's going to get in trouble for that." "Promise?" "I promise." Vivian filed a police report that afternoon. Judith Caldwell was cited for violating the protective order, but her attorneys quickly arranged bail. The consequence was a slap on the wrist for a woman with her resources. The third catastrophe hit that evening, and this one nearly broke Vivian entirely. She was preparing dinner when her phone buzzed with a news alert. Her own face stared back at her from the screen. Exclusive Caldwell wife allegedly coached daughter to lie about abuse, says former neighbor. The article quoted an anonymous former neighbor claiming to have witnessed Vivian rehearsing testimony with Madison, completely fabricated, but detailed enough to sound credible. Comment sections exploded. Social media turned vicious. Within hours, Vivian's name was trending alongside hashtags accusing her of parental alienation and evidence fabrication. She sat on her kitchen floor, head in her hands, while Madison slept peacefully in the next room unaware of the storm outside. Rachel called at 10. Don't read the comments. Don't engage with anyone online. This is a coordinated smear campaign funded by Judith. We'll counter it with facts. When does this end? Soon. The federal trial starts in 3 weeks. Once Garrett is convicted, Judith loses her leverage. The media moves on. This will pass. But Vivian couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing ground faster than she could recover it. Every step forward came with 2 steps back. The next morning brought another phone call, this one from a number she didn't expect. Agent Reynolds. Mrs. Caldwell, I need to inform you of a development. Garrett Caldwell has agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's implicating several executives at Sterling and Howe in a broader fraud scheme. Vivian blinked. What does that mean for my case? It means his cooperation makes him a valuable witness. The prosecutor is considering recommending probation instead of prison time in exchange for his testimony against the bigger targets. Probation, not prison, after everything he had done. That's not justice, Vivian whispered. I understand your frustration, but federal prosecutors have to consider the larger case. Garrett's cooperation could bring down an entire criminal network. Vivian hung up, feeling like she had been punched in the stomach. Garrett was going to wriggle out of this. His charm, his connections, his willingness to betray anyone and everyone would save him again. She sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall of her small apartment. Then something shifted inside her, a core of steel she hadn't known she possessed. No, she wouldn't let this stand. If the federal system wouldn't deliver justice, she would find another way. She picked up her phone and called Rachel. We need to talk about the divorce settlement. I want everything he has left. Every asset, every dollar, every piece of property. I want him walking out of that courthouse with nothing but the clothes on his back. Rachel was quiet for a moment. That's aggressive. He tried to take my daughter. He tried to destroy my reputation. He's about to escape prison through a plea deal. I want to make sure he pays in every other way possible. Then let's make that happen. Vivian smiled grimly. The war wasn't over, but she was done playing defense. The divorce trial began on a cold November morning. Vivian arrived at the courthouse with Rachel beside her, wearing the same navy blazer she had worn to her first job interview 15 years ago. A small act of defiance, a reminder of who she used to be before Garrett convinced her she was nothing. The courthouse hallway smelled of old wood and anxiety. Vivian's heels clicked against marble floors as she walked toward courtroom 3, each step carrying the weight of everything she had survived to reach this moment. Garrett sat across the courtroom with his expensive attorneys, looking thinner and more haggard than she had ever seen him. The federal investigation had taken its toll. So had the public exposure of his crimes. His custom suit hung loose on his frame, and his eyes had lost their predatory gleam. Judith Caldwell sat behind her son, dressed in black like she was attending a funeral. Perhaps, in some ways, she was. The Caldwell name she had spent decades polishing was now synonymous with fraud and betrayal. The trial lasted 4 days. Rachel presented everything with surgical precision. The financial records showing Garrett had hidden assets throughout their marriage, the evidence proving he had controlled Vivian's access to money as a form of abuse, the recordings demonstrating his willingness to use Madison as a weapon. Your Honor, Rachel said during her opening statement, this case is not simply about dividing assets. It is about recognizing that financial control is abuse. It is about ensuring that a mother who had the courage to fight back receives justice for herself and protection for her daughter. Helen Brennan testified via video link from her Manhattan apartment, her 73-year-old voice steady and unwavering as she recounted every damning conversation she had overheard through apartment walls. I heard Mr. Caldwell say, and I quote, I don't care about custody. I care about winning. Once I have Madison, Vivian has no leverage. Helen looked directly into the camera. That's not a father speaking. That's a strategist. And the strategy was cruelty. Madison's court advocate presented her psychological evaluation, documenting the anxiety and fear Garrett's behavior had caused. The advocate's voice softened as she described Madison's journal entries. The careful documentation a 9-year-old had kept because she loved her mother enough to pay attention. But the most powerful moment came when Vivian herself took the stand. Garrett's attorney, a silver-haired man named Douglas Pierce, tried to paint her as unstable, vindictive, paranoid. He referenced her postpartum anxiety from 9 years ago. He suggested she had manipulated her daughter. He implied she was motivated by greed rather than protection. Isn't it true, Mrs. Caldwell, that you coached your daughter to lie about her father? No. Isn't it true that you fabricated evidence to destroy your husband's career? No. I documented evidence that already existed. And isn't it true that you're simply a bitter woman who couldn't accept that her marriage had failed? Vivian paused. She looked at Pierce, then at Garrett, then at the judge. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried the weight of 11 years of silence finally breaking. For 11 years, I believed I was worthless because my husband told me so. I believed I was incompetent because he controlled every financial decision and told me I couldn't understand numbers. I believed I was crazy because he gaslit me every time I questioned his lies. She turned to face Garrett directly. Their eyes met across the courtroom. But I'm not crazy. I'm not unstable. I'm not vindictive. I'm a forensic accountant who finally remembered how to read the evidence. And the evidence proves everything I've said. Every lie, every hidden account, every manipulation. She turned back to the judge. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because my daughter deserves a mother who fights for the truth. And I'm here because I finally learned that I deserve to fight for myself. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even Pierce had no follow-up questions. Judge Patricia Winters, a silver-haired woman known for her no-nonsense approach, delivered her ruling on the 5th day. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious observers. The court finds that Garrett Caldwell engaged in systematic financial control and emotional manipulation throughout this marriage. His actions since the divorce filing, including false CPS reports, violation of custody orders through his mother's proxy, and coordinated media attacks, demonstrate a pattern of abuse that prioritizes control over the welfare of his child. Vivian held her breath. Rachel's hand found hers under the table. The marital estate is hereby divided 60-40 in favor of Vivian Caldwell, in recognition of her limited financial access during the marriage and his deliberate concealment of assets. Full custody of Madison Caldwell is awarded to Vivian Caldwell. Garrett Caldwell's visitation rights are terminated pending completion of a court-mandated psychological evaluation and parenting course. Rachel squeezed Vivian's hand tightly. Additionally, ma'am, the judge continued, her voice hardening, the court orders Garrett Caldwell to pay off all of Vivian Caldwell's legal fees, which currently total $437,000. Judith Caldwell made a strangled noise from the gallery. Her carefully maintained composure finally cracked. This court is deeply troubled by the behavior of all parties who assisted in the harassment campaign against Mrs. Caldwell. While not all actions rise to criminal charges, they represent a troubling pattern of using wealth and influence to manipulate judicial proceedings. Let this serve as a warning that this court will not tolerate such tactics. The gavel came down. Final. Absolute. Vivian walked out of the courthouse into bright November sunshine. The cold air hit her face, but she barely felt it. Madison was waiting with Rachel's assistant on a bench near the parking lot, having stayed home from school for the verdict. Mommy, Madison ran into her arms, nearly knocking her over with the force of her embrace. Did we win? Vivian lifted her daughter and held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. We won, sweetheart. We really won. 3 months later, Garrett Caldwell stood before a federal judge for sentencing. His cooperation with prosecutors had earned him consideration, as Agent Reynolds had predicted. But cooperation didn't erase crimes. Vivian watched from the back of the courtroom. She didn't sit in the front. She didn't need to be seen. She just needed to witness the ending. The judge reviewed Garrett's cooperation, his lack of prior criminal record, and the letters submitted on his behalf. Then she delivered the sentence. 3 years in minimum security federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release and restitution of $2.4 million. It wasn't the decades Vivian had hoped for, but it was something. It was accountability. As marshals led him away in handcuffs, Garrett turned and looked at her one last time. His eyes were hollow, defeated, broken. The man who had controlled her for 11 years looked small now, diminished, human. Vivian nodded once, then turned and walked out into the light. That evening, she and Madison celebrated with pizza on the living room floor of their new apartment. Madison's room had purple walls and butterfly curtains, exactly as she had always wanted. "Mommy?" Madison asked between bites. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad you fought. I'm glad you didn't give up." Vivian smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "I almost did. You know, several times. What made you keep going?" Vivian considered the question seriously. "You did. Every time I wanted to quit, I thought about what kind of example I wanted to set for you. I wanted you to know that standing up for yourself is always worth it, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Madison nodded thoughtfully, cheese stretching from her pizza slice. "I want to be like you when I grow up." Vivian pulled her daughter close. "You already are, sweetheart. You already are." 1 year later, Vivian stood in the lobby of Mitchell and Associates, a boutique forensic accounting firm in Stamford, Connecticut. Her name was now on the door. Junior partner. The first position she had held in over a decade. The path back to professional life hadn't been easy. She had started by taking freelance consulting work, using her recovered skills to help other women untangle finances hidden by controlling spouses. Word spread quickly. Her reputation grew. 6 months after the trial, James Mitchell had offered her a position. "We need someone who understands both the numbers and the human cost," he had said. "You understand both." Madison was assigning too. Therapy had helped her process the trauma of the past 2 years. She had friends, good grades, and a smile that appeared more often than not. On weekends, they explored the city together. Museums, parks, pizza places. Simple pleasures that felt extraordinary after everything they had survived. Vivian's phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Judith Caldwell dropped the wrongful death lawsuit. Sloane's family settled privately. It's finally over. Another weight lifted. Another chapter closed. That evening, Vivian took Madison to their favorite Italian restaurant for dinner. They had established a new tradition. Once a month, they celebrated simply being together. "Mommy, can I ask you something?" Madison twirled spaghetti on her fork. "Anything." "Do you ever think about Daddy?" Vivian considered the question carefully. She always tried to answer Madison honestly, even when the truth was complicated. "Sometimes I think about who he used to be or who I thought he was. I think about how different things might have been if he had made different choices." "Do you hate him?" "No, hate takes too much energy. I feel sad for him. Mostly, he had everything. A family who loved him, a career, a beautiful daughter, and he threw it all away for things that didn't matter." Madison was quiet for a moment. "I don't hate him either, but I don't miss him." "That's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to miss someone who hurt you." After dinner, they walked home through streets glowing with autumn lamplight. Madison held her mother's hand, chattering about a science project and a new friend named Sophie who wanted to come over for a sleepover. Normal child concerns. Normal life. A gift Vivian never took for granted. At home, Madison brushed her teeth and climbed into bed. Vivian tucked her in and kissed her forehead. "Mommy." "Yes, sweetheart. Thank you for fighting for me." Vivian felt her heart expand. "Always. That's what mothers do. And thank you for teaching me that telling the truth matters, even when it's scary. The truth always matters, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Madison smiled sleepily and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into peaceful sleep. Vivian stood in the doorway, watching her daughter rest safely in a room decorated exactly as she wanted, in an apartment they owned, in a life they had built together. She thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, isolated, controlled, convinced she was worthless because a cruel man had told her so every day for a decade. That woman felt like a stranger now. In the living room, Vivian poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city sparkled below, full of lives and stories she would never know. Her phone buzzed. A message from Helen Brennan. Saw you on the Mitchell and Associates website. So proud of you, dear. Some battles are worth fighting. Glad you fought yours. Vivian smiled and typed back. Couldn't have done it without you. Thank you for keeping receipts. She set the phone down and looked at her reflection in the window glass. The woman looking back was stronger, wiser, more whole than she had been in years. Garrett was in federal prison, counting down 18 more months. Judith Caldwell had retreated to California, her reputation damaged by association with her son's crimes. Sloan was gone, a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong person. But Vivian was here, alive, thriving, building something new. She raised her glass to her reflection. To starting over, she whispered, and to never forgetting who you really are. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the city in white, a fresh beginning, a clean slate. Vivian watched the snowflakes drift past her window and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, completely at peace. Not because everything was perfect, life rarely was, but because she had learned the most important lesson of all. She didn't need anyone to save her. She had always had the power to save herself. She just needed to remember it was there, and now she would never forget again. So our story has come to an end. Dear friends, if you're still here with me now, it means something in this journey touched your heart in a quiet, personal way. Maybe it reminded you of your own strength, or of a moment when you had to walk away from something that was breaking you. Maybe it reminded you of someone you love who needs to hear that fighting back is always worth it. Vivian's story teaches us something powerful. We don't control what happens to us, but we always control how we rise after. Some women wait to be saved. Vivian Caldwell saved herself, not because no one was there to help, but because she finally remembered she never needed saving. She just needed to remember who she was. And Madison, that brave little girl, reminds us that love is worth protecting, even when the path gets dark. Children see everything. They just wait to see what we'll do about it. If you're going through something painful right now, remember this: you're not alone, and this moment does not define your future. Your healing begins the moment you choose yourself. If this story moved you, even just a little, give it a like. Share it with someone who needs courage today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. We're right here with you. Always.